Are you happy? Really, ask yourself, how are you feeling? Are you feeling happy? Well, the thing I've learned is that happiness is not something that you can sustain forever. Happiness is just a moment of time. Let's talk about what it is to be in balance. The balancing act. On today's episode of Casting Actors Cast.
Welcome to Casting Actors Cast. It's the podcast for actors in the business of show. Here is your host, Jeffrey Dreisbach.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Casting Actors Cast. I'm casting director Jeffrey Dreisbach with McCorkle Casting in New York. How are you doing? Like I said at the very beginning, are you feeling happy? People can't feel happy all the time. Happiness is one of those things that you kind of get there, you enjoy it, and then reality sometimes sets in. So today's episode we're calling a balancing act, and I hope you stay tuned for this because I think that there's some valuable information that I hope you get out of this particular podcast. But this is that moment in the podcast where I want to say thank you so very much for listening. If you're new to Casting Actors Cast, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so glad that you're here. I'm delighted to be able to present these podcasts to you. If you are interested in past episodes of Casting Actors Cast, please go to castingactorscast.com, and you're going to find a bunch of past episodes. The entire archive is there. Also, there are some freebies at that website, and you can also let me know that you're a listener by clicking into Dive into the Talent Pool. It's a contact form, and that'll take you to a free downloadable PDF called Conversation Pieces Out of the Studio, the Voiceover Workshop for Professional Actors. It's a book on voiceovers. It's 100-page. It's free. Also, I'm just begging you, please, if you're listening on iTunes, I really want to get my numbers up as much as possible. We're well over 16,000 downloads, and I am so happy about that. But I would really love your support. Please, if you found this valuable, maybe there's a friend who you could send this to or remind them of or share with. It would mean a real lot to me if you could also leave a review. If you're watching on YouTube, for example, we're now doing podcast videos. So if you're watching me doing these podcasts live on video, then I would love it if you could subscribe, you could like, you could do all those things that let me know that you're out there and keep generating this excellent community of talented folks from all over the world that I'm hearing from. Also, don't forget, if you have a question at all about anything in the business, I would really love to hear from you. So thank you very much. Now, speaking of hearing from folks, I have a letter an email that I received, and I would like to share that with you right now.
Okay, let's check out this week's mail. Remember, if you have a question or comment, just go to castingactorscast.com and fill out the comment form. It's easy.
So here's a listener's question that I got a couple of weeks ago, and I've sort of backed up a few episodes. So I hope that listener who wrote this question is still listening, because I'm going to spend some time on your question today. But I'm going to paraphrase the email just a little bit in order to make it kind of clear what the question is. This girl from Georgia in the Czech Republic, and she's studying in the Czech Republic. She says, I'm a scientist, not a dancer, singer, or actress, but I imagine myself in film. I just want to try. From where can I start? So here's somebody who has a dream, an idea that this is maybe something that she would want to do, and has no idea about what would be the first and the beginning steps to talk about. And I thought, boy, this would be a really excellent theme to share. But first I want to answer her question. But I really want to talk to how we set ourselves up for disappointment and why we have these rich, full fantasy lives and what we can do to sort of not kind of squash dreams, but put a practical element into the thought process when you have these wonderful ideas or interests, or you have these wishes that you wish would come true. So to answer your question directly, if you have an idea that you want to be an actress and you want to do film, the very first thing you need to do is to become an actor. And that literally means find out in your area where there are classes, where there might be a group of actors who get together. Maybe there are a local college, maybe the college that you're studying at the Czech Republic, maybe there are some beginning acting classes. Maybe there is a film class where filmmakers might want to have actors help them do some of their assignments. So there's all kinds of creative ways, but the thing I want to stress the most is that you just have to start. You see, it's one thing to have the dream, but you need, in my opinion, to replace that dream with the reality of what it feels, looks, smells, and tastes like, so that you can get a full understanding about whether this is something that you want to do. So I think that we very much set ourselves up for disappointment. I certainly know in my life as an actor and now as a casting director that I am constantly setting myself up because I have this rich, full fantasy life about expectations. And I have these often, because I'm kind of a positive person, I have these very, full expectations about how I want the session to go if I'm doing a casting session. Or when I was acting, I had these kind of fanciful ideas about what would happen as a result of being in this Broadway show that's going to lead to this, and that's going to become that, and that's going to make this. And so I really kind of had these overwhelmingly detailed fantasies about what any of my situations that I found myself in would become. And you know what? I was always disappointed. And we always set ourselves, in my opinion, we always set ourselves for some level of disappointment when we go there. And I've done a lot of research, and I'm doing a lot of research into the psychology of this because first and foremost, I find this really fascinating. I find it really interesting what we tell ourselves versus the reality of what we find ourselves in. And so there's something to be said about all of the self-help stuff that's out there, right? When I was younger, I just read every self-help book I could get my hands on. The truth is that I suffered from depression. And the depression really was a way in which I had to make sense of a really difficult time in my life. And so when we find and I'm not a psychologist, I'm not trying to be one, and I'm not certainly trying to dispense any kind of advice at all, but I tried really hard by reading all of these self-help books to find ways to feel happier, that I just wasn't happy. And the reason I discovered that I wasn't happy was because I would always have these projections and I would always feel disappointed. I always felt that I was a loser in some of these choices that I made because they didn't work out the way I wanted them to. So the great I am, there it is. I want this outcome. It doesn't happen. And so I'm a failure. So it was this kind of hot and cold, really challenging time as an actor. So I would really celebrate these great highs when a great job came along, for example. I would be so thrilled. And guess what? That thrill, in some way, I had an expectation that that thrill was going to last a long time. And you know what? It never did. So even when something positive happened, it wouldn't sustain for a very long period of time. That our brains, our bodies can't function on this high level of adrenaline and happiness. You just can't. So it has to be balanced out. So that's the whole theme of today is a balancing act. So positivity, what we tell ourselves in a positive way so that we feel better about ourselves, is oftentimes not the same thing as the reality we find ourselves in. And it's that juxtaposition, good word, that juxtaposition between what we think it is and what it actually is can sometimes put us in a really challenging, bad state. So these are some things that we do tell ourselves. First of all, we beat ourselves up when something negative happens. We blame it on ourselves. We say, you know what, it's all my fault. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. I should have done this. Shoulda, woulda, coulda. I blame myself for whatever failure is in front of me or what I perceive to be a failure in front of me. And that's tough. And so that can perpetuate itself into this whole sort of negative spiral that puts you in a place that it's almost impossible to feel like you can climb out of that. It's a really it's a really hard thing to overcome sometimes. So I'm going to give you some thoughts or some suggestions to compensate for those, steep declines into this alternate reality. So if we don't blame ourselves, many of us will decide to blame others. We use rationalization to decide that it's all your fault, that you didn't see me as a talented person, so you don't know what the hell you're talking about. So it's somebody else's fault. So sometimes we'll use that as a defense mechanism because we don't want to take a look internally. But because we're creative people, we really need an answer. And so sometimes that answer can be blaming others. So that's a way in which we set ourselves up for disappointment. Because here is how it works. We receive input, whether it be a situation, whether it be a scenario, or whatever our reality is, we receive that information. And guess what? Our brains then interpret that information. Our brains look at that information and do some kind of interpretation, and then we decide on whatever outcome that's going to be. And so it's in that interpretation part, when it's internalized, that we can rationalize one way or the other how we feel about any given subject at any given time. And so that's how we set ourselves up. It's what I also call black and white thinking. It's either all great, nothing can go wrong, it was perfect, or it can be all bad. This was the worst thing that could have happened. We don't have or decide that that gray area has some value in it because it doesn't feel as satisfying. Hope that makes sense. So there are some solutions to all of this. And I don't mean to continue to just wax, philosophy and psychology with you, but I know that creative spirit inside of actors. I understand that. In my acting days, I went through an entire, roller coaster of emotional drama, and lots of highs and lots of lows. But I knew that there was something not right. Something wasn't quite working. And so it took me a while, but eventually I found some really excellent solutions to some of this. And the one thing is that when I received input from an external source, let's just say, for an example, that it was an audition and you didn't get a call back. You were expecting a call back because you thought you did so well, and then the callback doesn't happen. And so immediately the reality of not getting a callback sets us up for a series of thoughts, processes. The black and white thinking, they don't know what they're doing, it must be their fault, or I'm a terrible actor, why am I doing this? So it seems to be either one or the other. The solution, however, is a simple one. Hard to employ this method, but I'm going to ask you to try this out. And that is, be quiet with yourself and really decide what is a realistic projection of what took place. So instead of projecting an outcome, you're projecting the scenario. So yes, I did a really, really good audition. Maybe they were looking for something that I didn't show them that wasn't my fault. So you can literally spend a little more time as you think about those kinds of reality inputs. And you can, again, this is not a rationalization. It's just a realistic appraisal of the situation. Now, it's not going to make you really depressed and angry. It's not going to make you euphoric and happy. but it's going to keep you centered and focused because you're working toward finding out the reality of what took place. That you're not letting your brain go off into these different directions that may or may not be true. And the other thing that can help you is think about alternative what ifs. So when we project, for example, that we get to a point where we get a great audition and we're so excited about the audition, but we're really, really nervous because we really think this would be like the coolest job, that it would really increase our value as an actor, but it would also help us financially. All of these, it's important that rather than projecting outcomes, that, gosh, I hope I do really good at this audition, instead of doing that, the better choice would be to focus the energy on, so what if I don't get this job? What does that mean? Does it mean that I was really glad to get the audition? And what can I learn from that experience? Is that what that could mean? Now, what if I get the job? Sometimes there's a level of fear of success. That means I might have to go out of town for 8 weeks. That means that I might have to be shooting on location, which would mean I have to take care of, renting my apartment out, or, whatever life choices might be in front of you if you get the job. But being realistic and projecting those what ifs realistically will help sort of, in my mind, tamper some of those extreme highs or extreme lows that we find ourselves in. And finally, another solution to helping you achieve your goals would be, we need to see ourselves realistically as others see us. And I've mentioned this before, we have these things going on in our brains all the time, these voices in our heads, and it's our own voice, but it's our own voice that's oftentimes really critical. It's not our voice, because our voice has to be able to include reality and what's happening right in front of us. But the internal voice is doing that, what I talked about earlier, which is the input, interpretation, output. And it's in that interpretation that we listen to or pay attention to a voice that's not ours. Oftentimes it's ours, but ours when we were very, very, very young. That critical voice in our heads that, your parents might have instilled in you. I mean, this is a psychology that a lot of people are ascribing to, that feel is part of their process. And that is, if you had a critical parent, that nothing was ever right, that it's really hard, sometimes over even 20, 30 years, you still have an element of your inner voice that's saying those same things to you. Again, I'm not a psychologist here, but I know through my own therapy and through my own recovery from depression that I understand that critical voice in our head is not actually who we are at any given time. So what's successful to you might not be the same as the successful for others, but it's yours. And what kind of dream can you have that puts you in a place of feeling better? And part of that is to looking at the gray area, to embracing other choices that might happen as a result of either getting this job or not getting this job. And finally, I just want to share a quick analogy that Pat had shared with me. And she said, Jeff, the difference between you and I absolutely ascribe to this, is I look at a ladder and I'm looking up and I have to go up this ladder. Let's just use a realistic analogy. Maybe you're going to paint the side of the house and the paint job is your career. And she said, I look at the ladder as a step by step. That is one step at a time that I go. And many times, Jeff, you look at the ladder as the top step is the goal. Now, both are valid. But I will share with you that if you take it step by step, that there's less chance of setting yourself up for failure, or, more importantly, feeling like a failure. Thank you for listening. I'm Jeffrey Dreisbach, and this is Casting Actors Cast.
Casting Actors Cast is made possible with your support, just by listening. Please like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.